They tell you that truth comes slowly, like a drip from a leaky faucet. That's a lie. When truth finally breaks through, it's an explosion. It doesn't whisper. It doesn't whisper. It detonates. On a dull Thursday afternoon inside room 2154 of the Rayburn building, most of the House Oversight Committee wasn't even paying attention. Their eyes were on their phones, their whispers lost in the shuffle of aides moving papers, until one voice, steady and razor-sharp, had chew the static sake. Representative Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She adjusted her mic, looked straight ahead, and said the kind of sentence that makes history stop breathing. This is a hearing on federal transparency. The public has the right to know when a sitting president uses hidden accounts to support the secret existence of a child born outside his marriage. The room froze. The cameras tightened in. Somewhere above them, the faint whir of broadcast feeds carried her words to millions of living rooms in real time. And with them, the first crack appeared in the facade of one of the most guarded political marriages in America. In her hands was a slim manila folder, and inside, documents that could destroy a president, shatter a first lady, and shift the balance of an election year, a birth certificate, wire transfers, email chains with White House domains. And all of it placed neatly on the desk of the committee chair as if it were nothing more than a budget report. The chair tried to steer her back to irrelevant matters. She didn't flinch. "This is relevant," she said. And in that moment, she wasn't just a congresswoman. She was a surgeon, scalpel in hand, cutting away the last layers of polite fiction Washington hides behind. What no one knew yet, not the stunned committee, not the journalists frantically tweeting from the gallery, was that just 2 floors above in a separate wing of the building, Melania Trump was about to hear these words for the first time. And when she did, her body wouldn't hold her. Because some truths don't wait for permission. They crash the door, drag you into the light, and dare you to look away out 2 floors above the chaos. The East Wing was calm, at least for now. The First Lady was standing in a powder blue dress beside a table stacked with children's books, waiting for a small literacy event to begin. The cameras here weren't hunting for scandal. They were staged for smiles and safe headlines. But when her senior aide, Marissa Langdon, stepped into the room, the atmosphere shifted instantly. She wasn't holding her clipboard. She wasn't whispering like usual. She crossed the floor fast, took Melania gently by the elbow, and spoke with a tone that made the hair on the back of her neck rise. We have a situation. Melania barely turned her head. What kind? A Crockett? Oversight Committee. She just accused the president of having a child with a former staffer. She says she has proof, birth certificate, documents, live on camera. Every network's already running it. For a heartbeat, Melania's face didn't change, but her posture did. Her eyes narrowed, searching Marissa's expression for any sign this was some misinterpretation. "What documents?" she asked. Quieter now. Marissa's voice dropped. As she brought them into the hearing herself. It's trending worldwide. Melania stepped back from the table, her hand unconsciously lifting toward her chest, like she was trying to hold something in place. Her gaze flicked to the doorway. "I want to see it, now." The aide didn't argue. They moved quickly to a narrow side room near the elevator, just big enough for a desk, a few chairs, and a wall-mounted monitor. Marissa's fingers tapped the remote, pulling up the live hearing feed. The screen froze for a second, buffered, and then Jasmine Crockett appeared, calm, unshaken, finishing her sentence about a quiet boy who played piano and attended public school. And then came the final words, "Because Melania deserves the truth." It hit like a physical blow. Melania's pupils widened, her lips parted, but no words came. She didn't blink. She didn't move. "Madam First Lady," Marissa asked, "should I call medical?" Melania shook her head, but then her hand reached blindly for the back of a chair. She missed. Her knees buckled fast, too fast, and she went down hard, her shoulder catching the edge of the table before hitting the carpet. The sound was sharp enough to draw people from the hallway. Secret Service rushed in, staffers shouted, and in less than 90 seconds, paramedics were kneeling beside her, checking her pulse. She came to briefly, mumbling in Slovenian, before her eyes closed again. By the time they wheeled her out, the news cycle had shifted from rumor to spectacle. Back in room 2154, the air had changed. When Chairman Howard Greeley returned from the sudden recess, his face looked 10 years older. The murmurs in the chamber had hardened into a steady hum of tension. Journalists whispering into headsets, aides glued to their phones, every camera lens locked on the center of the table. Jasmine Crockett hadn't moved. She sat with her elbows on the desk, fingers loosely laced under her chin, the manila folder still in front of the chair. She knew what was coming. And there he was, Christopher Newland, senior legal counsel to the White House. Young, expensive suit. The kind of man who usually looked untouchable in rooms like this. Today, he looked cornered. He leaned forward, hands flat on the table. Representative Crockett, the materials you submitted contain unverified claims. They're verified, Jasmine cut in, not raising her voice. Sworn statements. Certified documents. If you'd like to deny them, feel free to do it on the record. Newland hesitated, his gaze flicking to the cameras. I'd caution you against presenting unproven allegations as fact. This could be considered defamatory. Then tell me what part is false, she said. Silence. The pause stretched. Go ahead, she repeated. I'll wait. The chair shifted uncomfortably. Representative Monroe from Oregon broke in. We are here representing the office of the president. Either this is fake or it's not. Which is it? Newland cleared his throat. I haven't had time to review the material thoroughly. Don't assure us, Jasmine said, her voice low and deliberate. Prove us wrong. The room seemed to close in around him. Tell us the child doesn't exist. Tell us the emails are forged. Tell us that trust fund isn't real. Tell the American people why the First Lady collapsed today, if not because she just learned her husband might have another child. Newland's jaw tightened. His aide leaned in, whispering frantically, eyes darting between the cameras and the manila folder. I am not authorized to respond to personal family matters of the president, Newland finally said. It was a dodge, but it wasn't a denial. Jasmine leaned back slightly, the faintest hint of satisfaction crossing her face. She knew exactly what that silence meant. Sometimes the most powerful confirmation comes from the refusal to answer. Jasmine didn't give them time to recover. She knew the White House wanted this framed as a personal matter, boxed in, diffused. That's how scandals die starved of oxygen until the public moves on. But this one had a heartbeat, and she wasn't going to let it fade. She leaned forward, eyes locked on Chairman Greeley. I'm saying the trust fund used to conceal this child was built with shell corporations never disclosed in federal financial statements. A ripple of murmurs swept the room. I'm saying those companies received preferential tax treatment while routing over $4 million to one woman over the course of a decade. The chair sat up straighter. Are you alleging misuse of federal resources? Jasmine didn't hesitate. Yes. Security personnel were deployed multiple times to escort Miss Dawson on flights paid for with government funds. That's taxpayer money used to hide a personal arrangement, and it happened under the protection of the United States Secret Service. Monroe's voice cut in, sharp now. Aha! Over how long a period? 12 years, Jasmine replied. 12 years of concealment. Across the table, Newland shifted in his seat, exhaling slowly like a man realizing the perimeter had already been breached. The scandal wasn't just about a secret child anymore. It was about corruption, hidden accounts, and abuse of the very systems designed to protect the presidency. The journalists in the gallery were no longer just taking notes. They were live blogging, sending bullet points to editors, rewriting headlines in real time. Greeley rubbed his temples, then said the words every political operative dreads. We will reconvene for a special session to examine these claims in full. Jasmine gathered her papers, sliding them into a slim leather portfolio. Thank me, she said. Just do your jobs? Do your jobs. As she stood, her phone buzzed once, an unknown number. One sentence. You're making powerful enemies. She stared at it for a moment, then powered her phone off. No reply. Not today. Across the room, Newland was leaning over to one of his aides, his voice a low hiss. But Jasmine didn't bother listening. She'd already won the first battle. The question now wasn't whether the truth would come out. It was how many people it would take down with it. The Ashfords never built their fortune by playing fair. And in 1937, the mask slipped for a brief, terrifying moment. It began with a man named Samuel Trent, a mid-level accountant for Ashford Holdings. He had worked in the shadows of their empire for nearly a decade, balancing books that didn't make sense, shifting funds to bank accounts that didn't officially exist. At first, he told himself it was all routine, just the way powerful families operated. But then, he saw a set of transactions that chilled him to the bone. Millions were funneled into an offshore entity, not for business, but for what was listed under a cryptic label. Restoration Project Arcadia. No one in the company had ever heard of Arcadia. No one outside the Ashford inner circle could access those files, and yet the money kept flowing, month after month, to a location that didn't appear on any map. Samuel tried to dig deeper. He traced the transactions to shipments. Crates loaded at night from Ashford-owned docks, each labeled with only a number, never a description. He caught glimpses of contents, ornate wooden chests, sealed metal canisters, and in one case, what appeared to be an ancient stone tablet covered in writing he couldn't identify. The symbols were jagged, almost burned into the surface. Then Samuel made his fatal mistake. He took photographs. Me took photographs. 3 days later, he vanished. His apartment was stripped bare, his bank accounts emptied, and the police report filed by his sister was quietly closed without explanation. When she pressed for answers, she was told Samuel had relocated overseas for a job opportunity. But the letter supposedly from him was typed, unsigned, and printed on Ashford Holdings stationery. Rumors swirled among dockworkers and junior accountants who'd heard fragments of the story. They spoke of an island the Ashfords owned but never visited in daylight, where only certain members of the family and their special contractors were allowed. Some claimed the shipments contained objects pulled from ancient ruins, things stolen from private collections, closed archaeological sites, even sealed tombs. The chilling part, every time someone whispered too much about Arcadia, something happened. Their job disappeared. Their home was sold without warning. In some cases, their names simply stopped appearing in public records. By the winter of 1938, the word Arcadia had become a curse in Ashford circles. No one spoke it above a whisper. No one dared write it down. And yet, the money continued to flow, as if the island itself demanded constant payment. If you think this sounds like myth, remember this. The Ashfords didn't just erase people. They erased the very idea that those people had ever existed, and Arcadia was the one place even they refused to explain. By mid-morning, the air inside the house felt wrong. Not just quiet, but thick, as if the walls were absorbing sound instead of letting it bounce back. Daniel Higgins stood by the front window, staring through a gap in the lace curtain at the church steeple that rose over the village. Its stone was older than anything else here, blackened by centuries of rain and smoke. He didn't go to services anymore, not since Father Ashworth had begun visiting their home without invitation. That first visit had been polite, almost overly so. The priest had brought a basket of bread and a bottle of dark, sweet wine. He'd asked about their health, their sleep, their dreams. But when Daniel mentioned the scratching in the walls, a sound like nails dragging along plaster, Ashworth's expression had changed. Not to concern, not to pity, but to recognition. As if he'd been waiting for Daniel to say it. Over the following weeks, the visits became more frequent, each one ending the same way. Ashworth would insist on praying over the children's bedrooms, whispering words Daniel didn't recognize. Words that were not Latin, not English, but something older. Each time, Martha would feel the air in the room turn colder, as if a draft had slipped in from a place that had no business touching their home. One night after such a prayer, their youngest, Lily, woke screaming. Not the cry of a child startled from sleep, but the raw, tearing wail of someone seeing something that should not exist. When Martha reached her, Lily was standing on her bed, pointing at the corner where the ceiling met the wall. "It's coming through," she sobbed. "It's almost here." The priest arrived at dawn without being called. He said little to Daniel and nothing to Martha. He walked into Lily's room, stood in that same corner, and pressed his hand flat against the wall. The house shuddered, not in the way buildings do when a train passes or wind pushes at the frame, but like something inside the walls was trying to get out. That was the day Daniel started keeping the fire burning in the hearth at all hours. Not for warmth. But because Ashworth had said in a voice low enough for only him to hear. Once the fire goes out, there's nothing left to keep them from crossing. By early winter of 1911, the locals of Blackthorn Hollow no longer approached the iron gates. Even the children who once dared each other to touch the cold, rusted bars refused to go near. The Ashford property had grown louder. Witnesses reported hearing what they called the mechanical heartbeat. a slow, rhythmic thumping echoing from deep beneath the manor, like a machine breathing under the earth. It was Samuel Ashford, the eldest son, who seemed most affected. Described as a quiet, studious man, Samuel was last seen in town purchasing an assortment of brass piping, industrial gauges, and a large shipment of coal. The blacksmith who sold him the parts claimed Samuel's hands were cold as grave soil, and that his eyes didn't blink once during their entire transaction. That same night, a solitary light burned in the manor's basement windows, a light that pulsed in perfect sync with the distant thump. The Ashford family stopped showing themselves entirely after that. Their correspondence to London associates ceased, the deliveries slowed, and the smoke from their chimneys began to carry a strange metallic scent. Those who inhaled it complained of headaches, nosebleeds, and, most disturbingly, nightmares. One farmer, desperate to retrieve a lost cow that had wandered too close to the property, swore he saw a figure standing at the upstairs window. It was not a man or woman, but a silhouette that bent forward in unnatural angles, its limbs far too long, its head cocked sharply to the side. He said it watched him the entire time he tried to lure the animal away, unmoving, unblinking. When word reached Reverend Kane, the village priest, he attempted to organize a delegation to confront the Ashfords. Only 2 men agreed to join him. They never made it to the front door. The trio stopped halfway up the overgrown drive when they noticed the ground trembling faintly beneath their boots, like something massive was turning below. Reverend Kane later said the vibrations were accompanied by an almost magnetic pull toward the manor, as though the earth itself were trying to drag them forward. That was the last recorded attempt to confront the family before their final disappearance. And the last winter Blackthorn Hollow would know them as flesh and blood. By the time the first frost painted the edges of the grass in pale silver, it was clear. The Ashford legacy was not just a history, it was a weapon. And like all weapons, it was forged for a purpose. The deeper I dug, the more I realized that every event, every tragedy tied to the Ashfords seemed less like coincidence and more like deliberate moves in a game most of us never knew we were playing. I found an old court transcript from 1894, buried inside a courthouse basement, bound in cracked leather. It described a land dispute between Samuel Ashford and a group of rural families who had been farming the area for generations. The Ashfords claimed the land under an obscure colonial grant, a piece of parchment so ancient and brittle that it looked like it would crumble at a touch. But the court, swayed by a missing evidence and witnesses who mysteriously recanted their testimonies, ruled in their favor. Overnight, families who had lived there for over 100 years were driven off their land. The farms became part of the Ashford estate and the displaced families. Not one of them stayed in the county. Some said they left to find work elsewhere. Others whispered they were taken care of. I traced the lineage of those families, but their records vanished after that winter. Birth certificates, marriage records, even gravestones, gone. The only hints of their existence came in the form of half-faded photographs found in thrift shops and boxes tucked away in dusty attics. People without names, places without memory. And that was when I began to see the pattern for what it was, erasure. Not just of land ownership or wealth, but of bloodlines. The Ashfords didn't simply want to rule the land. They wanted to control the very memory of who had ever been there. It was an old form of conquest, far more insidious than war, because when you erase the past, you rewrite the future. The house felt heavier as I sat with these thoughts. The whispers in the halls no longer seemed random. They were threads of a narrative too fragmented to grasp fully. Sometimes I thought I heard a child laughing just beyond my field of vision. Other times, I'd catch a shadow slipping through a doorway, only to find the room beyond completely empty. I began marking the events in a journal, aligning them against the historical timeline. What I found chilled me to the marrow. Every documented tragedy in this county, fires, disappearances, floods, had occurred within 2 weeks of an Ashford family meeting. They weren't just reacting to events, they were orchestrating them. And the worst part, chicken. The next family gathering was only 6 days away. The rain had stopped by the time I made it back to the lakeshore, but the sky was still low and heavy, like it was pressing down on the earth. The HOA board members had gathered there, 5 of them, standing like vultures in their pressed shirts and smug expressions. Their president, Harold Kane, stepped forward with that faux polite smirk he wore like armor. "Oh, we've decided your dock has to be removed immediately," he said, as if it were already done. You're in violation of the community shoreline ordinances. I let him finish, because that's what predators do. They let the prey believe they've won, right before the strike. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just pulled the folded documents from my jacket, the ones I'd been saving for the perfect moment. Deeds, surveys, historical plats dating back to 1894. I watched his eyes flicker when he saw my name not just on the lakefront, but on the lake itself. The entire waterway was mine, legally, indisputably, and with rights that superseded any modern HOA nonsense. Harold's smirk cracked just enough for me to see the fear underneath. The other board members started shifting their weight, glancing at each other like maybe they'd just stepped into the wrong kind of storm. I explained in slow, deliberate sentences how their bylaws had no jurisdiction over my land, how their so-called shoreline ordinances were as useful here as a paper anchor, how the only reason I hadn't enforced my property lines before was because I was a good neighbor, until they decided to make war. When I told them the new rules for my lake, I watched their faces drain like someone had pulled a plug. No hoey boats, no fishing without my permission, no swimming past the marked buoys, and those fancy lakefront paths they love to stroll. Closed, private property. Trespassers would be prosecuted. Orcs. They tried to laugh it off at first, tried to claim they'd take me to court, but the truth was written right there in black ink. And in this country, ink beats bluster every time. The meeting ended with Harold muttering something about reviewing their options, but I could see the defeat in his posture. They knew the war had shifted. That night, as I sat on the dock, the moon broke through the clouds, scattering silver light across the water. The surface was mine. The depths were mine. And for the first time, I understood the satisfaction of not just winning a fight, but owning the battlefield forever. The rain had stopped by the time I made it back to the lakeshore, but the sky was still low and heavy, like it was pressing down on the earth. The Chejorm board members had gathered there, 5 of them, standing like vultures in their pressed shirts and smug expressions. Their president, Harold Kane, stepped forward with that faux polite smirk he wore like armor. "We've decided your dock has to be removed immediately," he said, as if it were already done. "You're in violation of the community shoreline ordinances." I let him finish, because that's what predators do. They let the prey believe they've won, right before the strike. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just pulled the folded documents from my jacket, the ones I'd been saving for the perfect moment. Deeds, surveys, historical plats dating back to 1894. I watched his eyes flicker when he saw my name not just on the lakefront, but on the lake itself. On the lakefront, but on the lake itself. The entire waterway was mine, legally, indisputably, and with rights that superseded any modern hay bay nonsense. Harold's smirk cracked just enough for me to see the fear underneath. The other board members started shifting their weight, glancing at each other like maybe they'd just stepped into the wrong kind of storm. I explained in slow, deliberate sentences how their bylaws had no jurisdiction over my land. How their so-called shoreline ordinances were as useful here as a paper anchor. How the only reason I hadn't enforced my property lines before was because I was a good neighbor, until they decided to make war. When I told them the new rules for my lake, I watched their faces drain like someone had pulled a plug. No hoey boats, no fishing without my permission, no swimming past the marked buoys, and those fancy lakefront paths they love to stroll. They love to stroll. Closed, private property. Trespassers would be prosecuted. They tried to laugh it off at first, tried to claim they'd take me to court, but the truth was written right there in black ink. And in this country, ink beats bluster every time. The meeting ended with Harold muttering something about reviewing their options, but I could see the defeat in his posture. So they knew the war had shifted. That night, as I sat on the dock, the moon broke through the clouds, scattering silver light across the water. The surface was mine. The depths were mine. The depths were mine. And for the first time, I understood the satisfaction of not just winning a fight, but owning the battlefield forever. The rain had stopped by the time I made it back to the lakeshore, but the sky was still low and heavy, like it was pressing down on the earth. The Hoey board members had gathered there, 5 of them, standing like vultures in their pressed shirts and smug expressions. Their president, Harold Kane, stepped forward with that faux polite smirk he wore like armor. "We've decided your dock has to be removed immediately," he said, as if it were already done. You're in violation of the community shoreline ordinances, I let him finish, because that's what predators do. They let the prey believe they've won, right before the strike. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just pulled the folded documents from my jacket, the ones I'd been saving for the perfect moment. Deeds, surveys, historical plats dating back to 1894. I watched his eyes flicker when he saw my name, not just on the lakefront, but on the lake itself. The entire waterway was mine, legally, indisputably, and with rights that superseded any modern yay nonsense. Harold's smirk cracked just enough for me to see the fear underneath. The other board members started shifting their weight, glancing at each other like maybe they'd just stepped into the wrong kind of storm. I explained in slow, deliberate sentences how their bylaws had no jurisdiction over my land. How their so-called shoreline ordinances were useful here as a paper anchor. How the only reason I hadn't enforced my property lines before was because I was a good neighbor. Till they decided to make war. When I told them the new rules for my lake, I watched their faces drain like someone had pulled a plug. No Hawaii boats. No fishing without my permission. No swimming past the marked buoys. And those fancy lakefront paths they love to stroll, closed. Private property. Trespassers would be prosecuted. They tried to laugh it off at first, tried to claim they'd take me to court. But the truth was written right there in black ink. And in this country, ink beats bluster every time. The meeting ended with Harold muttering something about reviewing their options. But I could see the defeat in his posture. They knew the war had shifted. That night, as I sat on the dock, my dock, the moon broke through the clouds, scattering silver light across the water. The surface was mine. The depths were mine, and for the first time, I understood the satisfaction of not just winning a fight, but owning the battlefield forever.